The studio lights were calibrated to a softness that usually encouraged vulnerability. A golden hue meant to simulate a perpetual, forgiving sunset, but in this specific moment, the illumination felt clinical, exposing every micro-expression, every bead of sweat, and every hesitation. The air conditioning system hummed with a low-frequency drone that was usually inaudible beneath the chatter of a live audience. Yet now, it roared in the ears of everyone present, filling the vacuums of silence left between words that were becoming increasingly heavy. Jason Momoa sat on the left side of the crescent-shaped table, his body language expansive, taking up space not out of aggression, but out of a habitual, practiced comfort with being the center of gravity in any room. He wore a linen shirt unbuttoned to the mid-chest, layers of handmade jewelry clicking softly against the glass table surface whenever he leaned forward to emphasize a point. His presence usually a source of chaotic, joyful energy. Opposite him, sitting with a posture so erect it looked painful, was Angelina Jolie. She was a study in absolute reduction. She wore a charcoal blazer with no jewelry, her hair pulled back severely, exposing the sharp, unyielding architecture of her face. She had not moved her hands from her lap since the segment began. The interview had started as these things always did, a promotional lap, a celebration of cinema and celebrity. But the chemistry had curdled almost instantly, turning from a collaborative exchange into a slow-motion collision. "It's about the spirit of the thing, you know," Jason was saying, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that usually charmed millions, though now it seemed to bounce off the plexiglass dividers and fall flat on the floor. He gestured with a wide, sweeping hand, encompassing the studio, the cameras, the world beyond. "When I step into these roles, when I put on the armor or the leathers, I'm not just reading lines. I'm trying to channel something ancient. I'm trying to bring that warrior ethos back to a society that has forgotten how to bleed, how to fight for what belongs to it. It's a heavy weight, man. It takes a toll on your soul to carry that kind of archetypal energy. You go home at night and you feel the ghosts of these characters. You feel the burden of being a protector." He paused, looking to the audience for the customary nod of validation, the applause that usually followed his poetic musings on masculinity and strength. The audience gave a ripple of polite affirmation, but it was thin, hesitant, dampened by the icy stillness emanating from the other side of the table. Jason sensed the drop in temperature and pivoted his gaze toward Angelina, flashing that trademark crooked grin, a weapon of charm that had disarmed journalists for 2 decades. "You get that, right, Angie? You've been in the trenches. You know what it's like to carry the weight of the world on a movie screen. It exhausts you because you care too much." Angelina did not smile back. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, remained fixed on his face, studying him with the detached curiosity of a biologist examining a specimen under a slide. She waited 3 full seconds before responding, letting the silence stretch until it became a physical object in the room, uncomfortable and thick. "I think," she began, her voice quiet, melodic, yet possessing a terrifying clarity that cut through the studio's ambient noise, "that there is a distinction between the weight we imagine we carry and the weight that actually exists." She stopped there. It wasn't an attack, technically. It was a philosophical correction, delivered with the gentleness of a teacher correcting a slow student. Jason blinked, his grin faltering just a fraction before he reset his jaw. He laughed, a booming sound that felt too loud for the sudden intimacy of the moment. "Deep," he said, nodding rapidly. "That's deep, but that's what I mean. The imagination is powerful. If I believe I'm saving the world in that scene, if I feel that pain in my chest, then it's real to the audience. It becomes a shared reality. That's the magic of what we do. We suffer so they don't have to, in a way. We take on the darkness." Angelina tilted her head to the side. A movement of barely an inch, but it signaled a shift in the tectonic plates of the conversation. "We suffer so they don't have to," she repeated, tasting the words, testing them for structural integrity. "That is a very romantic way to view a paycheck, Jason." A gasp, sharp and involuntary, sucked the air out of the room. The studio audience, usually prompted to laugh or cheer, sat frozen, their eyes darting between the two titans. The hosts, whose job it was to mediate, to steer, to soften, were rendered obsolete by the sheer gravitational pull of the conflict unfolding. Jason shifted in his chair, the leather creaking loudly in the quiet. His brow furrowed, the easygoing surfer vibe evaporating to reveal a flicker of genuine irritation. "Whoa," he said, holding up a hand, palm open. "I'm not talking about the money. I'm talking about the art. I'm talking about the connection. When I'm out there in the dirt, sweating, bleeding for a shot, that's not about a paycheck. That's about honor. I'm telling stories about people who rise up. That matters. Inspiration matters." "Inspiration matters," Angelina conceded, her voice devoid of any soothing quality. "But we must be careful not to confuse the performance of struggle with the reality of survival." She uncrossed her legs and placed her hands on the table, a movement that felt like a declaration of war. "You speak of bleeding for a shot, you speak of the dirt. But at the end of the day, Jason, the dirt is washed off in a trailer with heated floors. The blood is corn syrup. The struggle is scheduled between lunch breaks." Jason leaned forward, his massive frame suddenly looking cramped behind the desk. He felt the corner, and his instinct was to push back, to use his physical presence to regain control of the narrative. "You think I don't know that?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave, losing the friendly lilt. "I'm not delusional, but are you saying that storytelling has no value? That because it's a movie, it doesn't touch people's hearts? I've had kids come up to me weeping, telling me that watching me fight gave them the strength to handle their own bullies, their own sicknesses. You can't tell me that's not real." "I am not saying the reaction isn't real," Angelina replied, her eyes never blinking, never wavering from his. "I am saying that the source of it is a projection. And when we, as actors, begin to believe our own projection, when we start to conflate our comfort with their crisis, we become dangerous." She paused, letting the word dangerous hang in the air like smoke. "We start to think that wearing a costume of a hero makes us one. We start to preach about honor and warrior spirits from the safety of a gated community. It becomes a vanity project disguised as philosophy." Jason's face flushed, a slow creeping red rising from his neck. He ran a hand through his long hair, a nervous tic that betrayed his composure. He looked at the hosts for support, but they were looking at their cue cards, terrified to intervene. He looked back at Angelina, his eyes narrowing. "You're coming at me hard today," he said, trying to force a chuckle that came out as a dry cough. "I thought we were here to talk about the industry. You've done the action thing. You've played the hero. You've held the guns. Are you saying you felt nothing when you did it? That it was just a job to you?" "I felt plenty," Angelina said, her voice dropping to a whisper that forced everyone to lean in. "I felt the adrenaline. I felt the ego. I felt the rush of looking powerful." She waited for the admission to sink in. "And then I went to places where people don't have scripts. I went to borders where mothers hand their babies to strangers because they can't feed them. And I realized that everything I had done on a screen, every pose I had struck, was a mockery of the strength I saw in those mud huts." She leaned in slightly, her gaze piercing through Jason's carefully curated persona. "I stopped playing those roles because I couldn't stomach the applause anymore. I couldn't stand on a stage and talk about warrior spirit while wearing a $10,000 suit, knowing that real warriors were dying in silence 5,000 miles away." The studio was absolutely silent. No one breathed. The only sound was the clicking of Jason's rings as his fingers tapped a frantic rhythm against the glass table. He felt exposed, stripped of the mythology he had built around himself. But he wasn't ready to fold. Not yet. His ego, the engine that had driven him to the top of Hollywood, roared to life in self-defense. "That's your journey, Angie," Jason said, his voice sharpening, losing the gravelly warmth and replacing it with a metallic edge. "And that's great. You do the UN thing. You do the diplomacy. That's beautiful. But don't sit there and judge me because I choose to bring joy to people. Not everything has to be a funeral. Not everything has to be a lecture on global suffering. People need an escape. They need to see someone win. I give them that." He gestured to himself, a two-handed thump on his chest. I give them energy. I give them love. I'm out there hugging people, connecting with the fans, touching the earth. I'm not up in some ivory tower looking down on the profession. I love this life, and I don't think there's anything wrong with celebrating strength. Angelina's expression didn't change. She didn't frown. She didn't scoff. She simply watched him with an intensity that suggested she was seeing the scaffolding beneath his skin. There is nothing wrong with joy, Jason, she said, her tone level. But there is something wrong with narcissism masquerading as service. The word hit the table like a gavel. Jason recoiled as if physically struck. Narcissism? He spat the word out. You're calling me a narcissist? I give everything to my fans. I give everything to my family. I'm the most accessible guy in this business. You're accessible, Angelina countered, because you feed on the reflection they give you. She spoke faster now, the rhythm of her speech accelerating, closing the exits. You talk about the earth, you talk about the spirit, but every story you tell comes back to you. Your feelings, your process, your burden. You treat the world like it's a backdrop for your own spiritual journey. She gestured vaguely at his attire, his jewelry, the carefully constructed aesthetic of the wild man. You dress like a nomad, you speak like a sage, but you live like a king. And when you sit here and tell us how hard it is to carry the energy of a fictional character, you aren't honoring the human spirit. You are trivializing the human experience. Jason slammed his hand on the table. It wasn't a violent slam, but it was loud enough to make the water glasses jump. That is out of line, he snapped, his eyes flashing with genuine anger now. You don't know me. You don't know what I do in my private time. You don't know what I support. You're sitting there with this ice queen routine, judging everyone who doesn't meet your standard of saintliness. It's easy to be high and mighty when you've decided you're above the industry that made you. He leaned in, his face inches from the invisible line that separated their territories. You think you're better than this? Better than us. You're here too, Angelina. You're under the same lights. You're selling a movie just like I am. I am here, Angelina said, her voice dropping to a terrifying calm, to speak about a film. Yes, but I am not here to tell the audience that my acting is a holy sacrament. I'm not here to pretend that my make-believe is a public service. She paused, her eyes locking onto his, holding him in a grip he couldn't break. And I certainly do not use the language of trauma to decorate my ego. Jason's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked around the room, desperate for an ally, desperate for someone to break the tension, but the audience looked away. They were witnessing a dismantling, a precise surgical removal of a man's self-image, and it was too intimate to watch. He looked back at Angelina, his eyes searching for a crack in her armor, a sign of hesitation. You're twisting my words, he stammered, his voice losing its resonance, becoming thin and reedy. I'm talking about passion. You are talking about yourself, Angelina interrupted. Not loudly, but with finality. Endlessly. And the world is tired of men who think their volume is a substitute for their virtue. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the silence of a pause. It was the silence of a vacuum. The air had been sucked out of the room. Jason Momoa sat frozen, his hands still half raised in a gesture of protest that he no longer had the will to complete. He looked at the camera, the red tally light staring back at him like an unblinking eye, recording his humiliation in high definition. He realized with a dawning horror that there was no comeback. There was no charm offensive that could undo what had just been said. She had named the thing he was hiding, and in naming it, she had destroyed it. He looked down at his hands, the rings, the bracelets, the symbols of the persona he had crafted so carefully. They looked like toys now, costume jewelry. He felt the heat of the lights not as a spotlight, but as an interrogation lamp. He looked at Angelina one last time. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't smiling. She was simply waiting for him to accept the truth. Jason pushed his chair back. The sound of the metal legs scraping against the floor was a harsh, discordant screech that made the producers in the booth wince. He didn't say a word. He didn't look at the hosts. He didn't look at the audience. He stood up, his massive frame suddenly seeming heavy, burdened not by a warrior spirit, but by the crushing weight of his own sudden irrelevance. He reached up, unclipped the lavalier microphone from his shirt, and let it drop onto the glass table with a hollow thud. The black plastic device rattled against the glass surface, spinning slightly before coming to a rest near his water glass. The sound was small, insignificant against the scale of the confrontation, yet it signaled a breach of protocol so severe that the camera operators hesitated, their lenses dipping instinctively as if to look away from a car crash. Jason did not look at the mic. He did not look at Angelina. He turned his body toward the wings of the stage, his movements stiff, stripped of the loose, aquatic fluidity that usually defined his physical presence. He took the first step away from the table, his heavy boots making a dull, thudding sound on the hollow riser of the set. The distance between the guest chair and the exit was perhaps only 30 feet, but in the heavy, pressurized atmosphere of the studio, it stretched out like a desert mile. Every eye in the room, the hosts, the audience, the crew hidden in the shadows, tracked him. They were waiting for him to turn back, to crack a joke, to reclaim the moment with a wink and say it was all a bit a performance piece on fragility. But his shoulders remained hunched, his head lowered, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the lights. He passed the main cameras, stepping out of the calibrated golden glow and into the harsher, blue-tinted spill of the backstage utility lighting. The illusion of the warm, inviting talk show crumbled with every step he took. He was just a man now, walking away from a conversation he had not been equipped to survive. He brushed past a production assistant who held a clipboard to her chest like a shield, her eyes wide with panic. But he didn't see her. He was entirely inward, trapped in the echo of the words that had just dismantled him. Angelina did not turn her head to watch him go. She remained perfectly still, her hands clasped loosely on the table, her posture unchanged. She stared straight ahead, her eyes fixed on the empty space where he had been sitting just moments before. There was no triumph in her expression, no flicker of satisfaction or regret. She simply existed in the vacuum he had left behind, a statue of resolve amidst the wreckage of the broadcast. Jason reached the edge of the set. He grabbed the heavy black curtain that separated the stage from the corridor, his knuckles white as he bunched the fabric in his fist. For a split second, he paused, the silhouette of his large frame framed against the exit, a final static image of defeat. Then he pulled the curtain back and stepped through. The heavy fabric swung shut behind him, oscillating slowly, cutting him off from the light, the cameras, and the silence.